Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Tom Temin.
Hello, and thanks for joining us on this Monday, November 13th, 2023, 7 minutes past the hour. I'm Tom Temin. Our producers are Eric White and Peter Masurlian. Our digital editors, Daisy Thornton and Darius Lauderdale. Coming up in this hour of the Federal Drive, what federal largesse looks like from a state budget official's perspective. Plus, how DoD and the Small Business Administration encourage investment in critical technologies. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. But first, women and some racial minority groups are fairly well represented in government compared to the nationwide workforce, but certain groups are still behind. Reports from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission show 3 specific groups that are falling behind. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman got details from EEOC social scientists Olisi Sawatu and Karen Brummond. You hear Sawatu first.
Where we start seeing issues is when we start talking about representation in leadership, primarily in pay. American Indian and Alaskan Native women, their participation rate in the federal sector is 0.8% compared to 0.3% in the CLF. African American women, their representation in the federal sector is 11.7% compared to 6.6% in the CLF. So we see they're doing really well in that regard. The federal sector is doing really well in that regard. However, when it comes to leadership, this is where we start seeing that they are underrepresented as executives, managers, and supervisors compared to representation, I should say, in the federal sector. And we also see where American Indian and Alaska Native women, they're earning 68% on a dollar compared to the government-wide average. African American women are earning 88 cents on a dollar compared to the government-wide average.
And Karen, I know that your report focused specifically on Hispanic and Latino women in the federal workforce. So tell me, were there similarities or differences to these other 2 reports in your research?
For Hispanic women and Latinas, there are some different findings than what was found for American Indian and Alaska Native women and for Black and African American women. Hispanic women and Latinas are underrepresented in the federal workforce. While they made up 6.2% of the civilian labor force nationwide, they only accounted for 4.5% of federal employees. They also resigned from the federal workforce at a rate almost twice the average for all employees government-wide. About 4.5% of Hispanic women and Latinas resigned in FY 2020 compared to 2.3% of all employees. Another difference between the reports was that Hispanic and Latino women held first-line supervisory positions in the federal agencies at a higher rate than their participation in the federal workforce. But like American Indian and Alaska Native women and Black and African American women, they were underrepresented in the higher leadership positions. They were underrepresented as managers and executives. Similar to the other groups, they were paid less than the government-wide average. Their pay was 82 cents on the dollar compared to the average federal employee.
And just quickly for clarification here, when you talk about the civilian labor force, or CLF for short, is that a measure of the private sector workforce? Does it include state and local governments, or what is really the comparison here?
It includes all employees in the United States, civilian employees in the United States, everyone, including federal, state, all employees.
Thank you. And you both spoke about disparities in leadership positions and the pay gaps that exist for these groups, but generally for the government, the pay system doesn't leave a lot of room for variability. So to me, it's a little bit surprising that there is still a pay gap here. Is that just based on the positions that these employees hold, or where does that pay gap come from?
We do have a lot of mechanisms in place in the federal sector to sort of prevent these kinds of things from occurring. In fact, federal employees tend to, on average, earn more than what they would earn in the CLF. The pay gaps are actually smaller in the federal sector compared to the CLF, at least for most populations. However, within the federal government, we do still find persistent disparities across the groups with respect to pay. Currently, we don't have an explanation for why that's the case. We see that the pay gaps are there now. We acknowledge that as an emerging issue, and then it becomes a question of why is that there and what to do about it.
And Karen, what about you? Was there anything in your report specifically that you want to highlight in terms of the pay gaps here?
For Hispanic women and Latinas, we do have specific numbers on that. Among Hispanic and Latino women nationwide, they were paid 72 cents on the dollar. However, in the federal government, Hispanic and Latina women were making 82 cents on the dollar compared to employees government-wide. We do see a substantial gap, but we need to dig further if we want to find out why it's different in the federal government. Previous research, such as that done by the Government Accountability Office, has found that differences in occupation tend to explain a lot of that, but then getting to the root cause of those differences in occupation takes a lot to go into. And these, as Mike said, are really broad reports, just identifying where the statistics are right now, getting the baseline, and then future research would have to be done to identify the causes of these, which will vary group to group, and they may vary organization to organization.
Where did the basis of these reports come from, or why did your team decide to drill down on these specific areas? How does this fit into the broader work that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission does?
These reports were meant to be drill downs as an opportunity to sort of identify things that we saw in the annual report that we thought may be happening. As we drill down, now we can confirm that these things are happening. We've identified an emerging issue. And what happens is that future opportunities now may bring us in a direction of explaining why these things are happening.
Within these current 3 reports, we've talked about disparities in leadership, disparities in pay. Aside from those, were there any other findings that really stood out to you when you were doing this research?
In the Hispanic Women and Latinas report, one thing that wasn't planning on analyzing in the report was the difference between resignations and retirements. The original plan was just to look at voluntary separations, that is, resignations and retirements combined. When I saw that Hispanic women and Latinas had a high rate of voluntary separations, it did lead me to want to dig a little further. And that led to the finding that resignations were the driving force of Hispanic women and Latinas leaving the federal government.
Among the African-American employees, African-American women, I should say, we did observe differences in voluntary separations compared to the government-wide average. But I think the more important factors were those pay gaps and also the drop-off that occurs as we move from, at least among American Indian and Alaska Native, as well as the African-American women, as we move from supervisors, managers to executives. The gaps become larger between their representation in leadership and their representation in the workforce as we move up that executive ladder. So that's going to be one of those things that we have to look out for.
EEOC social scientists Olisi Sawatu and Karen Brummond, speaking with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Check out Drew's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, how DoD and the Small Business Administration encourage investment in critical technologies. This is the Federal Drive with Tom Temin here on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.